So we've put a lot on real GDP and the output gap in terms of describing the overall expansion of an economy relative to its trend. And why do people obsess so much then over GDP? And as any textbook treatment will tell you, GDP is not a social, or it's not a measure of social good or welfare. It's a measure of the expansion of the economy. And generally speaking, when the economy is growing faster than usual, things are good for, say, unemployment. If it's growing lower than usual or contracting, then things are worse for employment. So let's talk about what GDP is related to versus what it may not be related to. So output and unemployment, for example, this seems like a duh moment because, of course, if the economy is growing quickly, a lot of firms are hiring, unemployment should be low. And how can we show that that's related? Well, remember the old slope equation that relates an x and a y coordinate from high school algebra. Y equals b plus mx, right? If your slope coefficient m is greater than 0, y is increasing as x is increasing. If it's less than 0, y is decreasing as x is increasing. And if it's 0, then y and x, really have no, at least by visual inspection, no relationship. You may have to go a little further to find a relationship then, but the visual inspection's not that clear on what's going on here. So, what I'm claiming here is as this y tilde is going out here, then unemployment's going down, and as it's going kind of back here, then unemployment is going up. So if m is greater than 0, we have this positive correlation between this x and y variable. If m is less than 0, then a negative correlation between this x and y variable, and we can quantify this relationship through a nice slope equation and estimate what that m should be. So the output gap then should be strongly correlated to this unemployment gap, or in other words, as we have this output gap rising and rising, this unemployment should be falling and falling, or these changes in unemployment should be responding to changes in output. Now, I'm being very lazy with my language here. What I should be saying is there's a relationship between the two, because causality can go both ways, right? In this particular case, correlation is not necessarily causation. So, in other words, increasing unemployment is usually related to a decreasing output gap. If we're falling away from the trend, we usually also observe an increase in unemployment. The unemployment gap, by the way, as I'm measuring it, is this changes in the U-in rate, that'd be the U3 rate on Fred, and the natural rate or non-accelerating rate of inflation. What do those look like? So let's look at U-in rate on Fred, and we can see during these recessionary periods, as indicated by the gray bars, we have increases in unemployment, then decreases in the expansionary period. These are people who are willing and able to work and actively seeking jobs. So if you're not actively looking, you're not counted in this measure. If you're in the military, you're not counted in this measure. These are people who are actively seeking jobs. And counted then there. All right, and if you've just given up completely, you're not counted then either. So the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment that's the lowest measure of unemployment that you can get. And then any further decreases in that unemployment rate would lead to an accelerated inflation rate or a faster price growth rate. Now this is tagged for I'm using the short run version of the NROUST. You could think of that as a potential unemployment rate. So like I have an output gap, I've constructed an unemployment gap. And this unemployment gap is very nice if you look at the dynamics of it. We see that increasing or above trend for the recessions, below trend for the expansions. So we kind of have, this output gap, but flipped. All right, so let's look at Okun's rule. Now, what that states is that for every increase in the output gap, there is a corresponding decrease in the unemployment gap. So we get this negative correlation going on here, which we see. We get a pretty nice goodness of fit there. So I've got it flipped on my axes here, excuse me, but all right. So if we've got this decrease in the output gap, we should be seeing this increase in the unemployment gap, or as an increase in the output gap, we should be seeing this decrease in the unemployment gap. And this is just a nice rule of thumb. Generally speaking, if you see unemployment going up, then output's going down. We should be entering into kind of this contraction phase of the business cycle. And so that's nice. Okay, great. But on the other hand, we have other relationships. with the ASAD model, we can strongly relate this output gap and this unemployment gap. So inflation and unemployment seem to have this kind of relationship. But what we can't talk about in terms of the output gap is maybe some other social measures, like let's say crime. This is something that kind of comes up as well. We were in a recession or contraction. We should be seeing more crime because more people are out there and desperate for jobs and income. So what we should be seeing then is we should be seeing this relationship between, say, if the output gap is going down, that crime measure should be going up. But if we run this data, the changes in crime over time in the U.S., specifically, especially violent crime is what I'm using here, seems to have no relationship to the output gap. It's slightly decreasing, but the goodness of fit isn't very good. Recession years basically don't necessarily mean more crime, and boom years don't necessarily mean less crime. So output growth doesn't seem to, over the long run, have a stronger relationship to crime as it does to employment. Now, we can look up some other measures. We can look at inequality, we can look at healthcare, we can look at other social measures, and then test and see if that output gap has a relationship to them. But for the purposes of this class, it's the unemployment gap that we really see as having a strong relationship to output, and that means jobs have a strong relationship to output.